After the undertaking that was the Baldur's Gate 3 review, I wanted a bit of a palate cleanser between courses, and indie games were thankfully here to deliver for a few first looks, starting with today's gem in the rough, God of Weapons. At first glance, you might see this as yet another roguelite, survivor-like, or bullet heaven flooding the market, and to an extent, this is true. But for me to review something in this genre, it usually has to be something that not only has fun things to do, but also has to bring something new or interesting to the genre. Because, let's face it, there's hundreds of these out there, and most of them are just carbon copies. Thankfully, the developers of God of Weapons did their homework, saw a few games they loved, and learned from them while developing this title that seamlessly combines the joys of a bullet heaven with the puzzle inventory aspect of Backpack Hero, and wraps it up in gameplay that is actually enjoyable to engage with, even if it is fairly simple. Now, the simplicity is further amplified by the fact that there is pretty much no story. Sure, the bosses have names and their own special mechanics, and each of the characters has a unique playstyle that they're designed around, some even being restricted from using certain weapon sets, but there is no overall world that I could discern while playing, so this is purely a game you would pick up for the mechanical aspects. Starting with the most basic of those, the actual combat, it is extremely straightforward. You are dropped into an arena, which is thankfully fairly limited in size, so it gives you a bit more of an intentional feel to the level compared to the near endless space of other bullet heavens. Though admittedly, it also has less arena variety, instead opting for giving you various obstacles like traps, wells, and different arena shapes. So to get through them, you just have to get your navigation and dodging down, which, yes, you do have a dodge action you can take that gets you out of sticky situations, whether they are from just more bodies or more projectiles, since, yes, enemies will shoot back in this. The cooldown length of this dodge skill is adjustable with meta progression, and you can even get modifiers on how it works from gear as well once you unlock it at least. In terms of how you aim and move, you actually get to choose. Want a more laid-back experience with auto-aiming? You've got it. Want something a little bit more akin to an action RPG? You can choose a manual mode that has you aiming with your mouse cursor, so you can focus down the particularly pesky enemies. And both are fairly straightforward to play due to their simplicity, and I recommend trying out them both to see which one fits for you. Same goes for the camera angle, which they give you the option of a high or low, though I do wish I could use keys to rotate the camera or even have a top-down instead of isometric view. They're not necessary, but it would be nice to have those. The real ingenuity comes from between levels though, where it integrates the Backpack Hero mechanic of Tetrising your gear into an ever-growing arsenal, whose slots you increase by killing enemies and gaining levels through your run. This, in and of itself, would be enough for me to honestly take interest in this title, since the idea of squeezing every last blade possible into my arsenal is a fun little concept. But instead, they took the puzzle element to the conclusion it kind of needed and made it so that all this gear also has interactions, ranging from the most basic being category interactions, where if you have a half dozen weapons with the sharp property, you get one bonus, while if you instead have a half dozen with the swift property, you get a different bonus, letting you get some nice global boost depending on what you focus on and what combos you get. And since you can stack these up to 9 of each, even if you have 9 of the exact same weapon, you can get some pretty potent improvements going on. Combine this with the non-weapon options for your backpack, which range from experience boosting scrolls to armor, rings, potions, etc., and even some items that latch on to proximity bonuses like a banner that makes weapons give armor and armor give damage, and managing the inventory gets way more interesting. The most important part of this though is that, much like those banners, a lot of weapons and trinkets also have these proximity bonuses. So do you put your big bad sword next to the dagger that gives it life leech, or would it be better to place your throwing knives there since they get an attack speed buff next to other daggers? It really makes a fun and interesting puzzle if you dive into the weeds. And thankfully, populating the backpack is pretty easy and straightforward since it is all done through a shop. You get 5 items to choose from that you can purchase between levels, you can even lock them in place, and you can re-roll them like you do in most roguelites with level-to-level upgrades. And what can pop up in these shops feels like it is actually tied to your character, since I never saw melee items on a character that couldn't use them. Same goes for range on a character that can't use those. So you don't have to worry near as much about bloat rather than just picking the character you want to play. And some of you may be somewhat concerned about the low-level weapons you naturally have available or the additional weapons you unlock keeping you from seeing high-level weapons you need. Thankfully, the game answers this by having tiered weapons. So every weapon you can find not only has the junky low-level version, but can be upgraded to higher tiers to improve their damage per second, and this is done in run. Though that does bring me to one thing I would plug into a wish list for this title. I really wish there was a way to combine weapons mid-run, even if you had to do the standard 3-to-1 method a lot of games use for upgrades. Sure, there's an item that lets you sacrifice it to upgrade one weapon one time, but it feels weird having a half dozen level 1 throwing knives as you're approaching the final boss of a run and not being able to condense them into something better. And yes, having 6 throwing knives gives you way better global boost than one upgraded throwing knife, but it would give you reason to not pass up low-level weapons nearly as much as I find myself doing at about the midpoint, and this would make it easier to really focus in on getting a specific theme going. Now that aside, as far as arranging stuff in the inventory, you're given a pinch of leeway by being able to take one item out and put it into temporary storage, but you will have to do some shuffling if you Tetris yourself into a corner and end up struggling to fit it all back in. And while you can lock things in the shop, there is no temporary storage for putting items you can't quite fit into your current plan in the actual battle. It's either backpack or sell, or you lose it. So it does take some planning to get some of the more esoteric achievements. In terms of the enemies you'll encounter, they're varied enough to keep it interesting, though you will get used to the amount of normal enemies as well as the elites after a few runs, and you will start to identify which ones are a problem to different builds. For some builds, it's the big tanky melee characters that low damage builds struggle with. For others, it's the casters that try to keep their distance from you. But most of the attacks are projected nicely, so 90% of the time, if you get hit, it's either your fault or your build just isn't killing fast enough. Though with runs from start to boss usually taking a bit over half an hour each, you will have plenty of time to adjust your strategy, and messing up on 1 or 2 levels isn't going to end your run. The last big things are classes and meta progression, which are somewhat tied since you aim for achievements to unlock classes. Sometimes this is just a number of kills across all runs, other times this is going to be a particularly hard to beat tier, like the case for the King that requires beating tier 3. And this is actually the main reason this is a first look rather than a full review, since I have not unlocked them all as of this point, and plan to just play this in my free time until I do. But each of the classes and subclasses I have unlocked, which is a bit over half of them at the point of writing this, feels unique because they give them unique restrictions, buffs, flaws, weaknesses, etc., and even in some cases very specific item pools or buffs that work with very specific setups. Even classes that would normally seem similar, like the Warlock and the Wizard, feel different because of the starting trinket options and stats really leaning into their core functions. The only other meta progression forms available are going to be your more standard generic boosts that give you extra slots at certain levels, life boosts, life recovery, pickup range, etc., which will be fairly expected perks for anyone that has played this genre before. And you also have an item unlock pool which gets you access to new weapons, armor, and trinkets. The cool thing about this equipment unlock system, though, is that it uses more of a shop interface. So instead of doing a run with, say, all flails to unlock a new mace, you instead get currency while going through the game and unlock options by doing that, and then spend the currency to pick and choose what you actually want to unlock and win. And if there's an item you see in there but never really want to use, you're not forced to unlock it to do something else and add it to the pool, since you can just ignore it, which helps customize the experience to what kind of player you are. Now, all that said, I do have to say that while it's not going to win Game of the Year or anything, or probably even be a cult classic, it is still a fun experience worth trying out if you enjoy genres it links to, like bullet heavens, isometric action games, or even to a lesser extent puzzle games. There's a lot to just enjoy here if you want to relax with a nice palate cleanser. And if you're not sure about it, there's even a prologue version which has a lot less content and progression options, but will let you get a feel for the very basic gameplay. In other words, a satisfactory demo. Though, if you enjoyed that, definitely look at picking up the full game so you can have that, but a lot more. And if you're looking for another one of the standout bullet heavens from recent history, check out the video on screen now. And if you want to see these reviews and first looks absolutely ad-free, hit up the Patreon where I upload ad-free archives of every guide and review.